Warning: the content of these videos contains adult themes which may be distressing. Viewer discretion is advised. Everything you are about to hear is taken from court documents, trial transcripts and various media sources. Hello everyone, and welcome back to True Crime with Mystery Maverick. Today we return to the suburban town of Rowlett, Texas. We will look at the aftermath of Darlie's arrest and the family's fight against the powerful systems. We dive further into the case files and explore the pretrial hearings that ensued as we continue to delve into the mystery, dying for justice, the wrongful conviction of Darlie Routier. Following her arrest for the murder of her two boys, Darlie had been detained at the Lou Sterrett Justice Centre without bond. Darlie spent the first 3 nights crying, naked and lying in an empty cell on a bare mattress on the floor under suicide watch. According to the book Hush Little Babies, a confused Darlie Key, bombarded by the police statements, would broach the subject with her daughter upon her first visit to the jail. She needed to know for herself if what the cops were saying was true. Her daughter needed some serious psychiatric help. She looked Darlie straight in the eye and said, "Did you do this?" On an interview with ABC's Sylvia Chase, Key shares her daughter's response. She said, "Mum, I saw a man. I did not do this to the boys." That's all her mother needed to know. Her daughter was innocent, and she would do whatever it took to prove it. The police had further spent hours trying to convince Darren of Darlie's guilt, that she hadn't tried to help the boys. "But she did, I was there." The police had advised him about the undisturbed mulch outside the window with the cut screen. There was no mulch outside the window. What they were saying didn't make sense, and he knew that Darlie did not kill their boys. In a later TV interview, Darren said, "Darlie said someone came into the house and I believe her." Many news broadcasts and publications were citing the arrest warrant that the physical evidence did not match Darlie's story, and further fueling the notion of Darlie's guilt and biasing the public perception of the case. Meanwhile, the RPD would release the information that Darlie's personal journal would be used as evidence against her and providing a vague motive for the murder of her children. The tabloid press had all but convicted Darlie long before she was brought to trial. On June the 21st, 1996, Darlie Routier, prisoner 010470, case number F9639972, would be sent to the Dallas County District Attorney's Office to prepare for trial. The case would land on the desk of lead prosecutor Greg Davis, somewhat of a poster boy attorney for death penalty convictions in Texas, and the Routier case would be just another point to add to his scoreboard. A little over a week later, a grand jury would review the case against Darlie, and on the 28th of June 1996 they would indict her for capital murder in the death of a child under the age of 6, and multiple capital murders for knowingly and intentionally causing the death of individuals Devon and Damon Routier by stabbing them with a knife. On the same day, the judge assigned to the case, Honourable Mark Toll, had made the decision that all the media attention would cause issues for the prosecution later in regards to her receiving a fair trial. Consequently, Toll ruled that Darlie, the lawyers, the police and any witnesses or potential witnesses were banned from talking to the media, any violations of which could result in a $500 fine and or jail time of 6 months. In the meantime, the family had another fight on their hands, as they were faced with the possibility of losing custody of baby Drake to the state. Immediately after Darlie's arrest, Child Services would arrive at Darlie Key's home and take Darlie's only surviving son into protective custody and place him into foster care. The family had a fight on their hands, not only against the state for Darlie's innocence, but now for the custody of Drake too. In an instant, Drake would not only lose his 2 brothers, but would be taken away from his loving mother and his father too for a period. However, on July the 3rd, 1996, a custody hearing was held at the Dallas District Court in regards to Drake's care. While Darlie was in custody, she had also been visited by a CPS representative, Jamie Johnson, whom she would tell of her struggles with depression after Drake's birth, and that she was finding it a struggle to care for 3 boys. She had further discussed her journal with her and said that there was a time when she had thoughts of suicide. Little did Darlie know that those conversations would come back to haunt her when Johnson arrived in court and advised that Darlie was a danger to her children and recommended that Darlie should not be allowed near her only surviving son. Thus, Darlie Routier, Darren's mother, had immediately applied for custody of her grandson. Consequently, District Judge Cheryl Shannon issued temporary custody to Darlie and Leonard Routier on the basis that Darlie had no contact with her son and that Darren would only be allowed supervised visits. In an article for the Houston Chronicle, although steadfast in her belief of Darlie's innocence, Darlie stated, "I have already lost 2 grandbabies. I have no intentions to lose another or put him in jeopardy in any way whatsoever by violating a court order." Following the court order, Darren had no objection against supervised visits and for Drake to reside in his parents' care, and stated, "I will not do anything against the law, never have, never will." On an episode of Lisa Gibbons, Darlie's mother, Darlie Key, explained the situation to an audience member who had questioned why Drake was with his grandmother Cerilda and not with Darren. "They came in and talked to us both, Darren and I, and said, if you believe in Darlie, then you're not fit to have this child in your home. So they took the baby from us. It wasn't that we gave him willingly." On an episode of Death Row Stories, Key remembers saying to the social worker, "You're not taking Drake, we haven't done anything wrong." To which the social worker replied, "Well, you think Darlie is innocent, so we can't be sure that you will protect him." To which Key responded, "My daughter is innocent until proven guilty, or is that changed now?" This lends further credence to the fact that Darlie was being painted by the prosecution as a guilty woman prior to the case ever reaching trial. A friend of the family, Vanessa, who was at the custody hearing, reiterated this fact when she said the ruling showed that people were already jumping to conclusions about Darlie's guilt. She further went on to say, "It's ridiculous. She's a wonderful mother. There's no question she's innocent." In an interview with the Dallas Morning News, Darren stated that he would sell everything he owned. "My whole life is for sale. My business, my home, my personal belongings. It will take everything I own to prove her innocence." While no one could fault Darren for his steadfast belief and optimism that she would be proven innocent, the state of Texas was a powerful entity, and all the belief in the world would not stand a chance against the authoritarian cyclone they were about to be drawn into. A few days later, at 9:30 a.m. on July the 5th, 1996, Darlie's defense counsel Doug Parks, Wayne Huff and Blake Withrow would appear before Judge Mark Toll in the presence of prosecution representatives Greg Davis, John Vance, John Groh and Sherry Wallace in a bond reduction hearing. Parks stipulated that there was no reason that Darlie would not appear in future court appearances, and that her ties to the community meant that she was not a flight risk, and there was no question that she would remain in Dallas County. However, Judge Toll denied a reduction on both charges and set Darlie's bail at $1 million. I believe one of the most telling aspects of Darlie's support system was that not only did her own family stand by her, but so did her in-laws and her extended family from day one, and would continue unabated to fight for her innocence and freedom. Following the hearing, Darren, along with Darlie Key and other family members, would begin raising funds in any way they could to bring Darlie home. People emptied their kids' college accounts and savings, and Darren's parents even released the equity tied up in their home to raise money for a reward fund. Their tenacity didn't stop there, however, and Darlie and Darren would do whatever it took to counteract the biased reporting. On the 25th of July 1996, the pair would make a 90-minute appearance on KRLD radio talk show hosted by Rick Roberts to proclaim Darlie's innocence. Key countered the idea that Darlie's wounds were self-inflicted and that she had killed the boys due to money troubles. Key said there were 2 $5,000 life insurance policies. That was not even enough to bury the boys. Darren stressed his belief in his wife and challenged the prosecution's case against her. I stand behind Darlie 150%. I know she didn't do it. I know all the millions of little pieces of this puzzle that will come out in the trial. However, in fighting for their loved one, the pair had violated Judge Toll's strict gag order, and the prosecutor was paying close attention. Subsequently, Davis would file papers to the court at the pair's blatant disregard for the order, but since the judge was on vacation at the time, nothing would immediately be done about it. In the book Dateline Purgatory, a Waco appellate attorney, Skip Reeves, said of Greg Davis, "He's a very effective and competent prosecutor. There's no doubt about that. I think he also does anything and everything he can to not only get a conviction but a death sentence. I think he feels absolutely no guilt. I think he's convinced that he's doing the right thing." Of no surprise to anyone, Davis would seek the death penalty against Darlie Routier, and the family would be embroiled in a fight not only for her innocence but ultimately a fight for her life. In a further pushback against the family's efforts, just over a month later, a 2-day-long hearing would begin in the Criminal District Court in Dallas County in a motion to hold Darlie without bond. The hearing began on Monday the 26th of August 1996 and was presided over by Honourable Paul Banner, sitting for Honourable Mark Toll. Looking like a shadow of her former self, Darlie would be led into the building, her roots starting to shadow her once blonde hair, and clad in white prison-issued coveralls with an angry red scar across her neck. Banner would commence the proceedings by directing both the prosecution and the defence teams to swear in all the witnesses and invoke the rule that witnesses be prevented from hearing the other witnesses in the hearing. First, the state's witnesses were sworn in, which included medical examiner Dr. Janice Townsend Parchment, lead detective Jimmy Patterson, first responder Officer Waddle, and trace evidence analyst Charles Lynch. When it came to swearing in the defence witnesses, Doug Parks told the judge they had stepped away. The judge responded by reiterating the rule and instructing that until the proceedings were concluded that no witness was to discuss with another person what their testimony has been or will be, unless talking to a lawyer about the facts they know. They must not discuss the facts of the case with each other and cannot be present in the courtroom whilst other witnesses are testifying. He further went on to mention the gag order that was already in place and stated that whatever terms that were defined in the order and failure to comply with this would result in parties not being able to testify and thus not being able to tell what they know to the court. Lead prosecutor Greg Davis would call the first witness for the state, medical examiner Janice Townsend Parchment, and the judge would dismiss the other witnesses to wait outside. She would begin by detailing the injuries sustained by Damon Routier, the most salient of which were 4 stab wounds accompanied by 2 incised wounds, all to his back. David would present a copy of Damon's autopsy report along with graphic photos of Damon's injuries. She testified that she believed that the wounds were consistent with a single-edged instrument such as a knife. She did not, however, mention the measurements of the 2 smaller incised wounds, and if they were or were not consistent with the same type of weapon. Davis went on to ask her about Devon's autopsy, even though she hadn't performed it. but she had reviewed a copy from her colleague, Dr. McLean. She explained that Devon had 2 stab wounds to his upper chest. One wound was to the left side of the chest, which went through the upper left lobe of the left lung and went through the pulmonary artery along the aorta and through the right lung, with a maximum depth of penetration estimated 5 inches. The second wound was also to the left side of the chest, slightly lower than the first, and went through the left lobe of the liver, with the maximum depth estimated 2.5 inches. She further gave the opinion that Devon's wounds were also consistent with a single-edged knife, and that Devon would have died, quote, very quickly, in a matter of a few minutes. Davis asked her to identify Darlie in the courtroom and asked her about when she had gone to see her at Baylor University Hospital. When asked if she had the opportunity to observe Darlie's injuries, in which she replied, "Well, as well as I could under the circumstances, yes." When shown pictures of Darlie's injuries, she stated she did not see the cuts on Darlie's hands. She described 2 wounds to Darlie's right forearm. One was less than an inch long that was uncovered. She states she could not examine the other larger wound as it was sutured closed. She claimed that although both Darlie and the boys had suffered from sharp force injuries, that Darlie's were not as deep as the boys and were in inconsistent areas. The boys' wounds were in their trunks, and Darlie's were not, apart from the one to the left shoulder and to the neck. She claimed that the other wounds on Darlie's extremities were somewhat superficial based on the boys' deep stab wounds. However, at the same time, she did say that she was told by one of the surgeons that the stab wound to Darlie's right forearm had gone through and hit the bone, but she thought that arbitrary, as the bone is close to the arm, and thought it more of an incise wound as a result. Davis used this opportunity to ask her if the smaller wound on Darlie's arm could have been a hesitation mark she had made by harming herself. Even though she conceded it could have been a hesitation wound, she said that it was a lot deeper than any hesitation wounds she had ever seen before. Even though she had not examined the wound to Darlie's neck and shoulder, she said that she had been told by a surgeon that these injuries did not hit any vital organs or major blood vessels, but went through the platysma muscle. She said she thought the wound to be around an inch in depth, but couldn't say for sure. Davis asked her if the wounds to Darlie's neck could have been self-inflicted, and she said they could have been. Lastly, in what would seem a bizarre line of questioning, he asked her if she had known that Darlie had breast implants, and she said she did not know. Under cross-examination by Douglas Park, she said she did not take any notes on her visit and that she did not review any medical records or reports, though she would say later at trial that she had read the medical records. The information she had gained had been second-hand from a resident surgeon whose name she could not remember. Parks asked her if she could see any hesitation marks present around Darlie's neck and shoulder wound. She stated that she could not tell because they were covered with steri strips. She went on to say that the only wound that could have been a hesitation wound was the smaller wound to the right forearm, but would only say it could have been, but might not have been. She further stated that in her experience there was usually more than just one hesitation wound present in self-inflicted injuries. Parks would further ask her if she had any explanation of the bruising going up the inside of Darlie's arm up to her armpit. She conveyed that she could not see the pictures, so didn't have an explanation. Parks suggested if the bruises could have been caused by the stab wound to Darlie's right forearm, to which the doctor replied that extensive bruising inside of the arm would be very unusual. She further stated that subcutaneous blood all the way up the arm did not make sense. The second witness called for the state was the first responder, Officer David Waddell. Davis would begin by asking Waddell if he was a Rowlett police officer, to which he replied he was not at this time. Without going into detail, Davis quickly moved on to June 6, 1996, and what he was doing that night. He said that he heard the call while on patrol at Victory Baptist Church around 2 miles away from the Routier home and went straight to the scene, arriving 2 to 3 minutes later. He further stated that he had not seen any suspicious vehicles speeding away from the area. He said that when he arrived, he parked on the north side of the house and noticed Darlie Routier was running from the front door out into the front yard wearing blue jeans, no shirt and no shoes. He said that Darren was hollering and telling him his kids were stabbed and dying and then following him inside. He did not mention approaching Darren with his firearm drawn, something he later described at trial. He said as he entered the family room he noticed a young boy lying on the left side of the wall and Darlie standing by the kitchen bar talking on the telephone 3 to 4 feet away from him. He said he went to look at the child and he was laying on his stomach trying to move and gasping for breath looking towards Darlie. Instead of helping Damon, he states he stepped over his feet and went over to Darlie to inquire about the suspect. Contradicting his later trial testimony, he does not mention instructing Darren to help the boys and says Darren went over to Devon. He would later say that he instructed Darren to help the boys and that he ran across the room to help Damon before running to the centre of the room to help Devon. In a move to paint Darlie as a cold and uncaring mother, the prosecution would ask Waddle about Darlie's actions that night. He stated that Darlie did not try to help Damon, even though he had his eyes open looking at them as they stood by the bar. Davis asked him if he had seen a towel on Damon's back and he replied, no, there was not, and that he had only saw Darlie holding a towel over her own neck. He went on to say that he had asked Darlie to give assistance to Damon, but she did not. Instead, she sat down where she was standing. He further said that the second time he asked her, she had just shown him the cut on her own neck and again refused to help her dying son. He further stated that Darlie was worried about the fact she had picked up the knife. He said that he told her not to worry about that and to get down and help your little boy there. I will keep an eye on the garage. Waddle claimed that he had a lengthy conversation with Darlie, who told him she had fought with someone in the kitchen and he had run into the garage and dropped a knife somewhere between the kitchen and the garage. However, under cross-examination, he stated that she didn't say where she was attacked, but that she had chased after the intruder. He then contradicts himself further by saying that when she had told him about the struggle with the intruder, she had pointed to the end of the bar in the kitchen, when she supposedly was standing at the end of the bar in the kitchen. None of this conversation, apart from Darlie speaking to the dispatcher about the knife and telling him to look out in the garage, is corroborated by the 911 call, and you never once hear him ask her to help Damon, although he claims he asked her 2 to 3 times. He said that after this, Darren was hollering back and forth at him to help and attempting CPR on Devon before saying it was no use and walking over to help Damon, but he did not know what he was doing as he was paying attention to the garage and just waited there until his backup, Sergeant Wallin, had arrived. He claimed that he couldn't tell if Darlie was crying, but she was hysterical, screaming and yelling. He further went on to say that he found it strange that she was more concerned about the crime scene than her dying children. Throughout his testimony, he does not mention having a conversation with Darren about going to the neighbour Karen Mills' house for help, something he would later testify to at trial and something Karen would also corroborate in her own testimony. He said as the paramedics took Damon away that he expected Darlie to stop them, but instead she sat on the floor as he had asked her to. He further stated she did not ask about her boy's condition, which does not coincide with the 911 call. When you hear the back and forth between Darlie and Darlie responds, "They're dead? Oh my God, Devon's already dead? Oh God." In addition, she did not need to ask. She was there. She knew their condition. She was screaming for help, shouting, "My babies are dying, they're dead." In an effort to show that Darlie didn't act appropriately, Davis asked the officer about other incident scenes he had attended where people were in shock, and if Darlie herself appeared to be in shock that night, to which he replied, "No, sir." His reasoning was that people he had previously dealt with were not capable of thinking about what was going on and won't worry about a crime scene when there's people dying around them. Under cross-examination, Wayne Huff asked him if he had ever been to any other murder scenes, how many, and if any had involved stabbings, to which he replied, "None." He further went on to say that most of the scenes he had been to where he believed people were in shock were car accidents. Huff asked him to describe what those people acted like in shock. Waddle said, "Well, they just act like they were in a daze and they really don't know what is going on around them." Huff would push further. He asked Waddle if people in the car crashes ever acted hysterical. "Sometimes, yeah." "Emotional?" "Sometimes, yeah." "Irrational?" "I guess they could." Next, Huff asked him how many people he had seen in shock who had just had their children stabbed in front of them, and how many people he had seen in shock who had not only had their children stabbed in front of them, but had also had their throats slashed. Waddle replied none to both questions. He further went on to say he had been to one other incident where a child had died in the presence of their mother, and that was an accidental drowning. Huff pushed Waddle for details regarding Darlie's appearance when he arrived at the scene, and the fact her shirt was dripping in blood. Waddle stated he was not paying attention to whether it was dripping, but conceded that her shirt was soaked in blood on his arrival. When asked about his arrival at Eagle Drive, and if he could have missed any cars on Rowlett Road, Waddle replied there could have been. Huff further asked if the 2 to 3 minutes it took him to arrive at the scene, if it would have given someone plenty of time for them to drive out of the area and back onto Rowlett Road, to which he replied, "Yes, sir." Huff then asked him about when he arrived at the scene and what Mr. Routier was doing and where he was going. In a bizarre statement, Waddle said that Darren was running out of the front door and that he didn't know where he was going, but he assumed he was running across the street. However, when Huff asked him if Darren had told him he was running across the street, Waddle replied no. Why would Waddle assume Darren was running across the street if he hadn't told him? At this point, Waddle neither knew Darren or the circumstances, so this seems an odd statement to make without any prior knowledge. Waddle described the route he and Wallin had taken when they went to search the garage, and he said he believed that both the utility room door and the door to the garage were both open. He went on to say that he did not notice blood on the door or the floor in the utility room. He further says that he did not see any blood on the washing appliances and there were no large objects obstructing the area around the kitchen sink. He says the only large object he saw at the time was a wine rack and a broken glass on the floor. Huff asked him to describe what the family room looked like when he first arrived at the home. Waddle said there were 2 couches in an L shape and a coffee table right in the middle of them. He stated there was a vase with flowers on the coffee table that were knocked over. He further stated that the TV was on even though he could not hear it, and he believed the lights were on too. He said he walked part way into the garage and peeked into the garage. Contradicting his previous testimony, Waddle said that there was blood on the floor and he may have stepped into it but couldn't remember. He went on to say he checked his shoes when he left the home and went to the backyard and saw no blood on the soles. Huff pushed the officer regarding the conversations he had had with Darlie, and he said that he, quote, "I remember some things that she told me, and that everything she had told him occurred prior to Wallin's arrival. This means that the discussions he had with Darlie would all be recorded on the 911 call, as Wallin did not arrive until the end." When asked if he remembers if anyone went upstairs prior to Wallin's arrival, he said no, but that after he had arrived 2 paramedics had gone upstairs, a claim which was not mentioned later at trial by either the paramedics or Sergeant Wallin. However, when asked again, still under cross-examination, he would change his story and state that when the paramedics got there and started treating the injuries after they had taken the first child out of the ambulance, myself and Sergeant Wallin went upstairs. He said he did not recall Darren going upstairs, but he could have. He further claimed that neither Darren or Darlie asked about the baby. He said that he was unaware about the cut screen in the garage until Wallin had told him about it, but didn't see it himself until later when he went into the backyard. Huff asked Waddle about the report he had written, and Waddle claimed to have written 3 reports following the incident, but then later admitted that it was the same narrative but written for all 3 injured parties. When Huff asked the positioning of Damon, he said that he was laying face down on the floor with his face to one side facing the sliding glass door, which contradicted his previous statement to Davis that he was laying face down staring in Darlie's direction, who was in the kitchen. Huff asked if any CPR had been administered before his arrival, and Waddle stated, "Not that I'm aware of." It would likely have been impossible for Waddle to tell whether or not CPR or first aid had been administered prior to his arrival, as he was not there. He went on to state that even though he told Darren to apply pressure to Devon, he did not see what Darren was doing. Huff would then hone in on Waddle's report on the 6th and the fact that it says he asked Darlie to render aid to Damon while he secured the scene, and nowhere in the report does it say that Darlie did not render aid to Damon. The officer tried to steer the attorney towards the supplement report on the 7th, but Huff would pull him back to his original report, and Waddle conceded that he had not written that in his initial report. Furthermore, Huff would point out that he mentioned it once in the report on the 7th, and not 3 times as he had earlier stated. He further claimed that he wrote this report 24 hours after the first one, after he started thinking back. In addition, the first time he had mentioned Darlie showing her wound to him and her actions being suspicious was on the 7th of June. Moreover, he went on to admit that although he himself had first aid training, that he did nothing to help the boys. He claimed he had written his first report around 7 to 8 a.m. in the morning, which further contradicted his later trial testimony. He further contradicted himself when he stated that he stayed on the door of the home until 7 a.m. in the morning. Huff further confronted the officer on his statement regarding Darlie screaming and yelling. Waddle admitted she was screaming and yelling for him to get help. When asked when he had learned that Darlie was a suspect in the case, he stated, "Probably while we were still at the scene." When asked who had told him, he backtracked and said no one told him, he just thought of it himself and that Darlie or someone in the house had done it. He stated before he left the room he had asked Darren and Darlie to sit by the sliding glass door so that the paramedics could work on the boys. Darren would contradict this in his testimony. When asked about this incident, Darren responded, "No, that never happened." Under redirect examination, he said that Darlie never mentioned the kitchen sink. Under recross, Huff asked if he had ever asked Darlie about the kitchen sink. He said, "No, sir." To be continued.